Welcome back for another deep dive.
Always happy to be back.
This time we're digging into Mark Manson's The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Okay.
And, it's not your typical self-help book. It's got this kind of in-your-face title,
Right.
but it's more about embracing the difficult parts of life, getting really real about our struggles.
Yeah, it's a definitely different approach.
He even quotes Bukowski's epitaph, "Don't try," to kind of hint at his whole philosophy.
Interesting. So, what's the core message?
Well, Manson's saying happiness isn't about avoiding problems.
Hmm.
That's just not possible, right?
Yeah,
Life is full of them.
it's more about solving them, I guess.
Exactly. It's about picking your battles and then figuring out how to win them.
I could see that.
And that's where the whole not giving a feck thing comes in.
Yeah, that title definitely grabbed my attention.
It kind of throws you off, right?
Yeah. At first I was like, wait, is this telling me to be apathetic?
Yeah,
But it's not about that at all.
not at all.
It's about being strategic with what we care about, with what we allow to affect us.
Exactly.
He says we only have so many effects to give,
Right.
and we got to be mindful about where we invest them.
I love that analogy.
It really makes you think,
He tells this funny story about an elderly lady at the grocery store.
Oh, yeah.
She throws a huge fit over a 30-cent coupon.
No way. Over 30 cents.
60 cents.
Wow.
And it just makes you wonder,
Hmm.
is it really worth that much energy?
Right. What's she missing out on by focusing on such a small thing?
Exactly.
And the other thing he talks about is how the less we have left to give,
Mm-hmm.
the more tightly we cling to the things we've already invested in.
Ooh, that's a good one.
It's almost like we become afraid to let go of anything
Right?
because what if we don't have any fucks left for something else?
It's like we're hoarding them.
Right.
Like they're going to run out.
Exactly.
And that's when we get stuck in those feedback loops from hell. It's what Manson calls that cycle of feeling bad about feeling bad.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I get that.
Yeah.
It's like when you get anxious about being anxious,
Exactly.
it makes it worse.
And
Yeah.
the more you try to fight those feelings, the
Yeah.
more they seem to stick around.
So how do we break free?
Manson suggests we actually lean into those negative feelings.
Really?
It sounds crazy, right?
Yeah.
But he's saying instead of resisting those emotions, we should try to just accept them.
like, just sit with them.
Yeah.
Even the uncomfortable ones.
Especially the uncomfortable ones.
Interesting.
Because when we allow ourselves to feel them without judgment, we can actually move through them more quickly.
Huh. I never thought of it that way.
He even uses this wild example of an LSD trip
Oh, wow.
to show how sometimes chasing happiness can actually take us further away from it.
Like, the more you chase it, the more it eludes you.
It's like chasing a mirage, he says.
Right.
And then he introduces this character.
Wait, who?
It's like a mascot for his whole philosophy.
That's okay.
Disappointment Panda.
Disappointment Panda. That's kind of funny,
Yeah, it's kind of brilliant.
but also kind of a downer.
Well, he's all about delivering hard truths about happiness.
Okay. What kind of hard truths?
He'd be the one to tell you straight up, happiness isn't some passive state.
Right.
It's an active process of solving problems.
Okay, but how does that work with this whole not giving a feck thing?
Well, sometimes those problems, the ones we choose to give a feck about, are going to involve discomfort, even pain.
Okay.
Like, think about when you stub your toe.
Oh, I hate that.
Yeah, it hurts like crazy,
Right.
but that pain is telling you something.
Yeah, be more careful.
Exactly. It's feedback.
So you're saying emotional pain is kind of like that.
Exactly.
It's a signal that something needs to change.
And Disappointment Panda would say, hey, instead of hoping for a life without problems,
Yeah.
hope for a life full of good problems.
Good problems. What are those?
The kind that push us to grow and become better versions of ourselves.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we know which problems are the good ones? The ones worth our facts?
That's where our values come in.
Okay.
And that's a whole other layer we'll get into.
Sounds good.
But first, we've got to talk about responsibility.
Okay.
Because Manson has this really interesting take on it. He even tells this story about a prince who tries to find enlightenment through suffering.
Oh, I think I've heard this one. Doesn't he, like, give away all his money and stuff?
Yeah. He lives as a pauper, thinking that hardship will lead him to some great truth.
Ah.
Well, he learns pretty quickly that suffering just sucks. It's a funny story, but it highlights this important point.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about seeking out suffering or wallowing in victimhood.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that life is a form of suffering for all of us.
In different ways, I guess.
Yeah.
We all have our own struggles.
And the key, as the prince eventually discovers, is to find that middle path to take responsibility for how we navigate those challenges.
So it's about owning our choices and reactions, even when things are tough.
Exactly, and that's where Manson's distinction between fault and responsibility comes in.
Okay. How does he differentiate those?
He says, we may not be at fault for everything bad that happens to us,
Uh-huh.
but we're always responsible for how we respond.
So, like, if someone gets robbed, it's not their fault, but they are responsible for how they deal with the aftermath.
Exactly. It's about owning your choices and reactions.
Okay, that makes sense.
And he's really honest about this in his own life, too. Like,
Yeah.
he talks about his past relationships, how those heartbreaks, even if they weren't entirely his fault,
Uh-huh.
they forced him to look at his own shortcomings.
Right, and how we could do better next time.
Exactly. He had to take responsibility for his part in things.
Makes the concept so much more relatable,
Totally. He's basically saying, hey, I mess up too. Life's messy, but we can learn from it.
Exactly. We're all just figuring it out as we go.
And speaking of messy, that brings us to one of the most thought-provoking concepts in the book, the tyranny of exceptionalism,
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. I think we can all relate to that.
especially in today's world.
Right, with social media and everything.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with these images of perfect lives and extraordinary achievement.
And it makes us feel like we're not good enough if we're not also achieving these amazing things.
Right. And that constant exposure to exceptionalism,
Yeah.
it can be really damaging. It makes us feel inadequate and entitled at the same time
It's a weird paradox.
because most of us are, well, average.
Right. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Exactly. But this pressure to be exceptional, it can push us to make choices that aren't truly aligned with our values.
So we end up chasing external validation instead of focusing on what actually matters to us.
Exactly. And Manson illustrates this with the crazy story of Hiru Onoda.
Who's that?
He was this Japanese soldier who refused to surrender for almost 30 years after World War II was over.
Seriously. 30 years.
He was hiding out in the jungle, convinced the war was still going on.
Wow. That's intense.
It's an extreme example, but it shows how clinging to distorted values.
In his case, blind loyalty and a refusal to accept reality.
Yeah, it led to a life of unnecessary suffering.
And it makes you wonder, what are we holding on to that might be based on this need to feel exceptional,
Right.
even if those things aren't really serving us?
That's a great question. What values are driving our choices, and are they actually leading us to a more fulfilling life?
That's a big question.
It is.
And I think that's where we'll pick up in part 2.
We're looking forward to it.
Me too.
Mhm.
So where were we?
We were talking about the tyranny of exceptionalism
Oh, right.
and how that can lead us to chase external validation instead of focusing on what really matters.
And how that ties into Manson's ideas about values.
Exactly. He uses these really interesting examples from the music world.
Oh, yeah?
Dave Mustaine, the former Metallica guitarist.
Oh, I know him.
And Pete Best, the drummer who got kicked out of the Beatles before they made it big.
Right.
And he uses those stories to show how different values can lead to very different outcomes.
Okay, I'm curious to hear how he connects those stories.
Well, Mustaine achieved a lot of success with his band Megadeth,
Yeah.
but he was always comparing himself to Metallica.
He was bitter about getting kicked out.
Yeah, and that resentment, that need for external validation,
Yeah.
it kind of fueled his dissatisfaction.
Even though he was successful in his own right.
Right. It's like he was chasing the wrong kind of success.
The kind based on comparison and competition.
Exactly. And that's the danger of prioritizing those external markers of success.
Yeah. You can achieve all the things you set out to do
Mm-hmm.
and still feel empty.
And then you have Pete Best, who got fired from arguably the biggest band in the world.
Ouch.
Right. But he chose to focus on different things.
Like what?
Family, stability, inner peace.
And he found happiness through those values.
He did. He actually said in an interview that he wouldn't trade his life for all the money and fame in the world.
Wow, that's powerful.
It is. And it shows how choosing values that are truly aligned with what matters to you, that's what leads to genuine fulfillment.
It's like he redefined what success meant for him.
Exactly. And Manson provides some really thought-provoking questions to help us do the same.
Like what?
Like, what metrics are we using to measure our own success and happiness?
Okay.
And are those metrics actually serving us?
Right. Like, are we chasing someone else's definition of success?
He even asks, what would it mean if I were wrong about my current values?
Whoa. That's a tough one.
It is. But it forces you to really examine those beliefs.
To challenge those assumptions and be open to other possibilities.
Exactly, because maybe there's an even better, more fulfilling way to live.
I like that.
And that brings us to another important concept in the book: embracing failure.
Okay.
Manson sees failure not as something to be avoided, but as an essential part of growth.
So it's not about being perfect or getting everything right all the time.
Not at all. It's about being willing to experiment, to take risks,
Mhm.
and to learn from those experiences, even when they don't go as planned.
He talks about this in his own life, right? His
Yeah.
early struggles as a writer.
He does. He was broke, living on friends' couches,
Yeah.
but he used that time to learn and refine his craft.
So he's saying those early failures actually helped him become a better writer.
They did. And he's not alone in that. So many successful people have stories of early failures.
Right. It's like those setbacks often pave the way for future triumphs.
And he encourages us to reframe those experiences. Instead of seeing them as setbacks, see them as feedback, opportunities to adjust and try again.
And that's where his concept of VCR questions comes in.
Right.
Those questions that seem so complex from the inside, but have really simple answers from an outside perspective.
And those questions often stem from our fear of pain or discomfort.
So we get stuck in our heads,
Yeah.
overthinking and overanalyzing things.
And that fear paralyzes us.
He gives those examples, right? Like the girl who's miserable in med school,
Yeah. But she's too scared to drop out.
and the guy who's terrified to ask his crush out.
Exactly. It's like from the outside, the solutions seem obvious, but their fear is holding them back.
So what's the antidote to that? How do we overcome that fear and start taking action?
That's where Manson's emphasis on action comes in. He says we shouldn't wait for motivation to strike.
Right.
We have to act, even when we don't feel ready,
Even when it's scary.
especially when it's scary, because action often leads to motivation.
It's like the more you do something,
Yeah.
the more you want to do it.
Exactly. It's like building momentum.
Yeah.
And this applies to all areas of life.
Like relationships.
Yeah. Manson talks a lot about that too.
What's his take on relationships?
Well, he emphasizes the importance of setting boundaries, taking responsibility for our own emotions, and being willing to both reject and be rejected.
Okay, that sounds healthy.
It is. It's
Yeah.
about having self-respect and knowing what you deserve.
And not settling for less.
Exactly. And he draws a clear line between healthy and unhealthy love.
Okay, how does he do that?
He uses Romeo and Juliet as an example.
Really?
Yeah. He's saying our culture romanticizes these unhealthy relationships.
Oh yeah, that whole tragic love thing.
Right. We mistake drama and intensity for genuine connection.
So what does healthy love look like?
For Manson, it's about clear boundaries and mutual respect.
Okay, and how do boundaries play into that?
It's about understanding where your responsibility ends and your partner's begins.
Oh, right. That ties back to his concept of responsibility without fault.
Exactly. In a healthy relationship, both partners own their stuff and they support each other's growth,
Yeah.
but they don't try to fix each other.
It's about being a team.
Exactly. Not a therapist or a savior.
Right.
And he talks about codependency, those victim and savior dynamics.
Right, where one person is always rescuing the other one.
And that stuff often comes from patterns we learned early on in life, from our families, the roles we were taught to play.
Okay, I can see that. So how do we break those patterns?
It starts with awareness, recognizing those dynamics, and then setting boundaries and taking responsibility for our own emotions.
And sometimes that means rejecting or being rejected.
Exactly. And Manson argues that that's actually a sign of strength.
Really?
Yeah. Being able to walk away from something that isn't serving you, that takes courage.
It's about knowing your worth.
Exactly. And trusting that there's something better out there for you.
That makes sense. And he even talks about how rejection can play a role in rebuilding trust after infidelity.
He does. It's not about pretending everything's okay.
Right.
It's about acknowledging the broken trust and then addressing the underlying issues.
And that takes a lot of work, right?
It does. It takes honesty and commitment from both partners.
They both have to be willing to do the work.
Exactly. And that's a perfect segue into our final topic.
Which is?
Mortality.
Oh, wow. We're getting deep now.
We are. Manson tackles this head on in the last chapter of the book.
What's it called?
And then you die.
Straight to the point.
He doesn't sugarcoat it.
So what's his message?
He starts by sharing this really personal story about losing a close friend when he was young,
I see.
and how that experience forced him to confront the meaning of life
Yeah.
in the face of death.
That's heavy stuff.
It is. But it's also incredibly powerful
How so?
because it reminds us that our time here is finite. we're not going to live forever.
Yeah, that can be scary to think about.
It can be. But Manson argues that this awareness can actually be liberating
How so?
because it helps us to focus on what truly matters,
Right.
to let go of the things that don't. It's like that whole idea of carpe diem.
Seize the day.
Yeah, live in the present moment.
Because all we really have is now.
Exactly. And when we embrace that reality,
Yeah.
it can help us let go of a lot of the anxieties and fears that hold us back.
The things that keep us from living fully.
Exactly. And it's not about being reckless or irresponsible.
Yeah.
It's about making conscious choices aligned with our values and then taking action, even in the face of uncertainty.
I think that's something a lot of people struggle with,
The uncertainty.
Yeah, and the fear that comes with it.
It's natural to feel that fear.
Of course.
But Manson argues that we shouldn't let it paralyze us.
It's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway.
Exactly. Because often those are the moments that lead to the greatest growth.
He talks about that in his own life, right?
He does. He shares this story about how he used to be terrified of talking to strangers.
Really?
Yeah. He just assumed people wouldn't want to talk to him.
I think we've all felt that way at some point.
Totally. But then he started pushing himself to engage with people, and he found that more often than not,
Yeah.
they were actually pretty receptive.
It's like we create these self-imposed limitations based on our fears and assumptions.
And then those fears become self-fulfilling prophecies.
Because we avoid the things that scare us.
Yeah.
Which just reinforces the fear.
It's a vicious cycle, but we can break free from it by taking action even when it's uncomfortable.
Even when our brains are screaming at us to run the other way.
Especially then, because that's where the real growth happens.
Outside of our comfort zone.
Exactly. And that's how we discover what we're truly capable of.
And what truly matters to us.
Exactly. And that brings us to another really important point, the value of community.
Okay.
Manson talks about how important it is to find people who share our values. People who support us on our path.
Our tribe, so to speak.
Yeah.
Those people who get us.
Exactly, because we're not meant to do this alone.
We need each other.
We do.
Right.
And it's not just about receiving support, it's about giving it to.
Right, it's a two-way street.
Being there for others, celebrating their successes, and offering a shoulder to cry on when they fail.
Those authentic connections are what make life rich and meaningful.
And I think that's ultimately what Manson is trying to convey in The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Feck.
Yeah.
It's not about being indifferent or apathetic.
Right.
It's about choosing what matters to you. And then committing to those values, even when it's hard.
Even when it means facing those uncomfortable truths.
And being willing to let go of the things that are no longer serving us.
It's about creating a life that feels authentic and aligned with who we truly are.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Yeah.
I'd love to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
Keep questioning, keep exploring,
Yeah.
and keep living a life that feels truly your own.
Beautifully said.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time.
See ya.